All right, everyone, it is 10 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get us started. Good morning, I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's office manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Author Search Confusion. Let's talk about personal names in RDA and MARC. And today's presenter, Dr. Karen Snow. Dr. Karen Snow is an associate professor and PhD program director in the School of Information Studies at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. She received her PhD in Information Science from the University of North Texas and worked as a cataloger in the Rare Book Room, University Archives, and the Technical Services Departments at the University of North Texas. She currently teaches beginning and advanced cataloging courses at the Dominican University, both face-to-face and online. Please welcome Dr. Karen Snow and enjoy her webinar this morning.
Thank you, Taylor, so much. Good morning, everyone. Let's talk cataloging. Are you all ready? I am. So please feel free, as always, to type in that chat area if you're able to. I know, Jessica, yay, exactly. Just please, so if you have any questions as we go along or just comments about anything, please type there. I will be monitoring that as we go along. So this is me. And if, as always, if you do have any questions after the webinar that you want to ask me about, my email address, really easy, ksnow@dom.edu, please email me and I'm happy to respond. All right, and what are we going to be talking about today precisely? Okay, so we're going to first talk about authority control. Okay, so since these authorized access points for personal names, really the main point of having them is to have good authority control in your catalog. I want to just at least talk the basics of authority control and why it's beneficial in a library catalog. I also want to provide some definitions here for what RDA means by persons, because it's not what you may think it may mean, as well as what is meant by authorized access points. That's really a key concept here that we're going to be talking a lot about. I also want to talk about how we find personal name authorized access points using what are called authority records. Okay, so they essentially document information about a personal name authorized access point. So we're going to talk about, what are they and where we can find them, as well as how we then take that information and place it into a MARC bibliographic record. Okay, so what we see when we're searching the library catalog. Okay, so how this is all connected and how you can do your part to maintain a nice, healthy, and effective and efficient library catalog for author searching. Okay, that's going to be really important for this. So, okay, so authority control. So I'm going to start off with our favorite person in the world. I'm sure those of you all, especially all who work at public libraries, I'm sure you love this man very much, right? Because you get at least about a book a month or something, or maybe a week every day. I don't know, that has James Patterson's name on the cover. So I'll just start with him. I think that he's a good place to start here. So okay, yeah, Yvonne, like a few a week. Wow. Okay, so but he's a very productive guy, or at least he has a very vast network of people writing on his behalf. So he can put his name on the cover. But anyway, setting that aside, I just did a Google image search for James Patterson. And of course, the James Patterson author that we know and love is the main image that comes up, right? But he is not the only person in this world with the name James Patterson, as you can imagine. Okay, so for us, he's the most famous one, but he's not the only one, right? So I did get some hits for other James Pattersons as well, who are not necessarily authors. So if we look this name up in what is called an authority file, okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. We'll see there's, like I said, there's a lot of James Pattersons out there. Okay, so you change his name. And so in library catalogs, you may have multiple people named James Patterson who are authors or illustrators or translators or editors. And so authority control helps us kind of corral this, okay, kind of makes sense of names. so that you can find the James Patterson or specific author, illustrator, translator, etc. that you're looking for. Okay, so because the key to what is called authority control is this idea of uniqueness, standardization, and linkages. Okay, so it's, as it says here, it's a technical process executed on the library catalog to provide structure. Okay, so I have my poster boy for authority control that I like to use in my classes, Puff Daddy. If you're not familiar with him, real name Sean Combs, and he is a rapper and producer who likes to not use his real name, but he likes to use different stage names, and he changes them over the years, right? So I think currently he's using Diddy, but he's been, Puff Daddy, Puffy, P Diddy, etc. So, right. So how do we make sense of this? How do we ensure that our patrons can find everything in our collection by a particular author or Puff Daddy if he's using different names on his various resources? Okay, so that's really what we're going to try to figure out here. So authority control, if we just choose one form, right, so a standardized in one form of his name, and use cross-referencing. So Susie, you mentioned cross-referencing. That's part of this as well. So that if someone searches for Puff Daddy, okay, so maybe not his current preferred form of name, they'll still be able to find his kind of, preferred form, authorized form, and then still be able to find everything that is in the collection that's associated with him. So there's all that kind of going on with authority control. Okay, and if you are using a catalog that is using authority control with like authority reference records and cross-referencing, then you may see something like this. Okay, so like on the screen where like if you type in Sean Combs in the author search, it'll give you some sort of prompt to say that's not used in this catalog, we use Diddy instead. Okay, but I recognize the fact that not all catalogs will have something like this, and that's okay. Okay, we can still maintain authority control, at least to an extent, right, without having this go on, having these prompts. But this is kind of, I guess, the ideal, obviously, if the catalog is able to do that. Okay, but like I said, it doesn't have to work that way. It's just helpful anyway to be able to determine what is the kind of authorized access point for authors, so that you can just use that to search, to differentiate, right, from other people with the same name. So let Michael Jordan, for example, right? So here I just went to a catalog. I limited my search by author because otherwise, I can just, Michael Jordan will pop up anywhere and everywhere. So if I did that, then I'm going to get different resources by different Michael Jordans, like, like Michael B. Jordan, right, the actor. Okay, so yes, I'll get those search results, but I'm also going to get search results for the other actor / athlete, Michael Jordan, right? So both Michael Jordan. So this way, if we have different forms, if they are both just Michael Jordan, then yes, we're going to get kind of a mishmash of resources for both of them. But if we want to, once again, we want to be targeted, right? If we only want to bring up resources associated with Michael B. Jordan, then it's helpful to know his authorized access point, so we can do that. So we can then kind of get rid of other Michael Jordans from the search result list. Okay, right. So how we do this in the catalog. So this is just a kind of a quick little MARC bit for Puff Daddy's Forever album. And we've talked previously about the 245 field. That's our title statement, if you recall. That has our title proper, subtitle, statement of responsibility, and that remains the same. Okay, that regardless, that won't change over time because that represents what's actually on the resource itself. So this one is title is Forever, and it has Puff Daddy as his name on the CD. Okay, so, but what's in the 100 field of the bibliographic record will be the authorized access points that may change over time. Okay, either if like a preferred form of name may change, like Puff Daddy changes his name, continues to change his name from Diddy to something else, or dates, right? So having birth and death dates, that's a very common addition in these authorized access points, and so people they die, right? So if they do, then if he would be horrible, but if he does die, then we would add the death date after that hyphen in the name. So and having the dates, that's like I said, probably the most common way to differentiate names from one another, and so that's why that's here. And so and this is, I think, a good example of how even if someone's preferred name doesn't change, we do still need to kind of update, maintain our catalog in case the dates change as well. That's probably going to be more common that those change. So it's not the type of thing where we just kind of throw into our catalog, oh, here's the authorized access point, and never touch it again. In order for it, once again, to have proper authority control, you need to keep it updated. You need to maintain it, because otherwise, the computer system will see Diddy 1969 hyphen as a different Diddy from a Diddy with the his birth year and like a death date. Okay, so we want it all to be the same, ideally. Okay, different Diddy, many different Diddies. Okay, all right, so and this stems from this idea of including what are called agents, is from Ferber. If you remember our webinar from many months ago, we talked about the different entities in Ferber. These are the group 2 entities, or agents, either persons, families, or corporate bodies. Okay, so that's all within RDA section 3. And so that's what I'm going to be kind of pulling from, like the rules that I'm going to be talking about is from primarily this section 3. Okay, but let me once again kind of go into our definition part of this, because I think it's important to understand how RDA defines certain terms, because it's not, like I said, sometimes it's not always how we would normally think about how we would define something. So so first of all, RDA defines an agent as just a person, family, or corporate body. Okay, that anyone essentially can be an agent. A person is defined as an individual or an identity established by an individual, either alone or in collaboration with one or more individuals. That is a somewhat confusing definition that we're going to unpack in just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside for just for now. A family is defined as 2 or more persons related by birth, marriage, adoption, civil union, or similar legal status, or who otherwise present themselves as a family, okay, as opposed to a corporate body, which is an organization or group of persons and or organizations that is identified by a particular name and that acts or may act as a unit. Okay, so it actually seems very similar, but I mean, obviously the family, they're connected in some way, in some familial way. But then corporate bodies are also multiple people or organizations, like, a government agency, an actual corporation, as well as like musical groups are all considered to be corporate bodies. Okay, so all of these can be, we can have authorized access points for all of these things. Okay, really any of, person, family, or corporate body associated with the resource. Okay. Now, if we specifically look at names, okay, so RDA does define a preferred name for a person as the name or form of name chosen to identify the person. And this is core, this is required in RDA, that if we have someone involved in the resource, whether that's, the author or the composer or the performer or the translator, we need to identify what their preferred name is. Okay, and that's we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's generally chosen based upon what the person prefers and what is actually used on the resources we collect. Okay, so for example, Diddy You know, a couple of years ago, he kind of threatened to change his name again, right? He talked about it in an article, but he didn't actually publish anything. He didn't put out a new album or publish a book with the new name. Okay, so just because someone talks about changing their name doesn't mean we change the preferred name in cataloging. Okay, all right, and then part of the preferred name for a person is part of an overall authorized access point. This refers to the standardized access point representing an entity, in this case, an agent, right? And so we can create authorized access points, like I said, for people, family, corporate bodies, using, you know, the preferred name is the kind of the core, the main part of the authorized access point. So let's look at an example. So this name, so Dickens, Charles, 1812 to 1870, is an authorized access point, right? It is composed of the preferred form of his name, so Dickens, Charles, as well as his birth and death dates, right? Because there are other Charles Dickenses in the world that have the same preferred form of name. In order to make his authorized access point unique, his birth and death dates have been added. Okay, so and that's fairly common. Like I said, there's other ways that we can make the authorized access point unique, but I'll show you that in just a moment. But dates tend to be the most common one that you're going to find. Okay. So here's some further examples just to give you a sense of kind of the breadth of authorized access points. In addition to the dates, you may also find like a middle initial or like a middle name. You know, if it's like a fictitious character like Harry Potter, adding in parentheses fictitious character, all sorts of things. I mean, the key is depending on how much information you have, you know, you may want to put different things depending on the situation. So like in that second bullet point, the Mrs. Maxwell Davis, it used to be, you know, a couple hundred years ago that women, sometimes they just wrote under their husband's name and just put Mrs. in front of it. So there may be situations where we, in addition to not knowing their birth and death dates, we don't even know their first name, right? So we just kind of use the name that's used on the resource itself, and then just kind of adding, making sure we add like Mrs. To that authorized access point to distinguish her from her husband, Maxwell Davis. So, so there's all sorts of things, right, that we can add, even if it's like a phrase, like this last one, John Moss, the poor blind man belonging to the 57th Regiment. If that's really all we know about this John Moss, this cataloger felt like this is then what we add to make sure that this John Moss is differentiated from other John Mosses. So, and RDA says that there's a lot that we can do. So here, I just wanted to point out the list of different, you know, like attributes that we can include, either as part of the authorized access point or in or elsewhere, like in the authority record, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. Okay, so just some examples. So within the authorized access point, we want to include obviously the preferred name for a person. Okay, right? That's core. We have to do that. But then, if need be, within that authorized access point, we can include a title if there's a title associated with them, either in terms of like royalty, nobility, whatever, or like Mrs., right? So date of birth, date of death, obviously, other designation associated with the person, if they're like a Christian saint or a spirit, a fictitious or legendary person, a real non-human entity. I'll explain what that means in just a moment. Profession or occupation, right? If that helps, if we only really know like their profession or occupation, we can, especially if we actually have to include this, if we do have a name that does not convey the idea of a person, I'll also come back to that one as well. And then maybe an identifier as well of some sort, okay, whatever that may be. Okay, but key to understanding the authorized access point for personal names in RDA is understanding what RDA means by a person. Okay, so let's talk about that. So I mentioned before that this is the definition that RDA provides for a person. So an individual or an identity established by an individual, either alone or in collaboration with one or more individuals. And I promised I'd come back to it, and here we are. we're back to it. Okay, so what does this mean? So what RDA means by this is that a person can be like an individual who is currently alive or has lived, like a human being, right? Who is, like Jane Austen, or Puff Daddy, or so, any person that's alive, Karen Snow, etc. That has lived or is alive that's human. Okay, so Jane Austen uses Jane Austen, is the name on her works, okay? But we can also have situations where we have two or more people who use a pseudonym, for example, like Magnus Flight. I don't know if you've heard of this quote unquote person, but this is actually two women authors who write together under this pseudonym. I'm blanking on their names right now, but they actually write separately as well, like under their real names, but they write in collaboration under this pseudonym Magnus Flight. So Magnus Flight is also considered to be a person according to this definition because it's an identity that's established in collaboration with one or more individuals. Okay. In addition to that are real non-human entities like the Obama's family dog, Bo Obama, which is, there actually has been something that he, once again, quote unquote, wrote under that name. And so even though I seriously doubt that someone like put a pin in Bo Obama's paw and moved it around the page to create something, it wasn't actually Bo Obama who wrote whatever that work is. It was an identity that was established that was used to write and under his identity, right? So that would be an identity, right? So still he's a person as far as RDA is concerned. And this is also applies to like fictitious characters like Geronimo Stilton, which once again, those of you all who work with like children's materials, you've probably seen this, where on the title page it actually says, this, it's like a mystery series, right? So it's like a series of mysteries. So here's the title, and then it's by Geronimo Stilton. Okay, this not real mouse cartoon. Okay, but once again, he's an identity. He's been established. It shows that he is the author. So therefore, he is a person, as far as RDA is concerned. Now, you may just be wondering, okay, this seems very silly to be saying that a dog is a person and a cartoon character is a person. But it's very user-friendly and practical if you think about it, because do we really want, or should we expect, children to come into the library and know who it is who's actually writing the real name of the person who's writing under the pseudonym Geronimo Stilton? Okay, is that something that we should expect our patrons to know so that they can find what they're looking for? And I'm hoping that your answer is no, that we should not expect that we should allow our patrons to find works, with the names that are associated with those works, that popularly known under those works. Okay, so that's why RDA has kind of broadened this definition of person, so that people can more easily find works by author or illustrator or artist or whatever. Okay. So, and this kind of plays to this idea of preferred form of name, right? So we want to allow whoever, the creators and contributors to works, to use the name that they prefer on their resources so people can find them more easily, right? So RDA does say that when choosing the preferred name for a person, generally choose the name by which the person is commonly known. Okay, the name chosen can be the person's real name, pseudonym, title of nobility, nickname, initials, or other appellation. So, so whatever they use on their work is really what we should go with. Okay, so as I said, considering the situation, and then if they change that, we change the preferred form, right? So that's what we do. Okay. Now, we do have situations where we have individuals with more than one identity. So unlike like the Puff Daddy situation, where it's essentially one identity for Puff Daddy, he keeps changing the name of that identity, if that makes sense, from Puff Daddy, P Diddy to Diddy, etc. Okay, but we do have situations of persons who have multiple identities, and we want to once again respect that. and use whatever identities they choose as their preferred name for that particular identity. So some of you all already know this, what's on my next slide, but if you don't, then I'm about to blow your mind. There you go. Is that Nora Roberts, Sarah Hardesty, and JD Robb are all one person, or real name Eleanor Robertson. Okay, that's her real name, but she uses multiple identities. Okay, Nora Roberts is the identity that primarily writes romantic works in the United States. For some reason that I don't really quite understand, she uses Sarah Hardesty for the romantic works written in the UK. And then the mystery novels that she writes are under JD Robb. Okay, so once again, these are all separate identities that she's established for these works, and therefore, once again, we treat them as such. We, once again, do not require our patrons to know this is actually Eleanor Robertson, because she does not use that on her published works. And we don't expect them to know that JD Robb is actually Nora Roberts, is actually Sarah Hardesty, etc. Right? So we make connections, right? We still have the cross-referencing going on, because that's part of authority control, is the cross-referencing. But otherwise, these are the names she uses, so that's what we have in the catalog. Yeah. So so kind of keeping that in mind. Okay, so in addition to this, otherwise we just take whatever the preferred name is, and we, if we have like a surname, like a forename and a surname, we just flip it. Okay, so that's one of the main guidelines for recording names, containing a surname. Put the surname first, then a comma, and then whatever else, like a forename, middle initial, middle name, etc. And then if there's only a surname, then just put the surname. Okay. There's obviously going to be other instructions depending on the situation, depending on the name, and also depending on the culture or language of the name, right? So RDA does have some kind of exceptions that you should be aware of. This is in RDA 9224, where they direct you to Appendix F, or if you have a name, for example, that uses like the Arabic alphabet, or Chinese names containing non-Chinese given name, Icelandic names, etc. There's always some some slightly different rules, right, instructions associated with those. So so kind of keep that in mind as well, right? Because not all names follow what we're used to, I guess, in the English language. So. And then, like I said before, I won't spend too much time on this, but dates are what you're going to find most commonly in authorized access points, and because they're core. They are required, not necessarily within the authorized access point, but it's certainly recommended. Okay, so because it does say that we can record them as separate elements, like in the authority record, for example, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But we can also make them part of the access point. And that's what it says here. We can also just, even if it says that it's optional, we can just kind of add them anyway. But the second bullet point says that if you do have a situation where you have someone, like multiple people with the same name that were born in the same year, we can add additional information like month and day of birth if we need to do that. Okay. This is just a cheat sheet, if you will. And by the way, I should have said this at the very beginning, but most of you, I think, know this already, is that you're going to get this PowerPoint after this webinar at some point within at least the next few days. So you'll have access to this. But I just wanted to kind of point out how some typical constructions of dates, what you saw under the previous set of cataloging rules, the ACR2, and how they look under RDA. Okay, so and I just wanted to kind of point out, I mean, in some cases it's very similar or exactly the same, right? Obviously under RDA we want to write out abbreviations as much as possible. That's why we use like January and March as opposed to Jan and Mar. Same thing with the Latin abbreviations, right? So instead of using CA period representing circa, we use approximately under RDA. Instead of abbreviating like born and died as B and D, you could write that out under RDA, or the Library of Congress and Program for Cooperative Cataloging policy is actually not to do that, but to use just, if you know, for example, when someone was born, but not when they died, then you still just put like their birth year, like, Smith, John, 1825 hyphen, which I like to call the bibliographically undead, because unless they're vampires, they're probably not alive anymore, right? So someone born in 1825. But that's the LCPCC policy, so that's probably what you're going to see most often. And then if you only know the death date, but not the birth date, LC and the PCC uses like hyphen, and then the year, like hyphen 1859. So you may see this done in slightly different ways, but it all kind of means the same thing. But here, once again, this is just kind of some general guidelines on what you'll see for the date part of the authorized access point. So, okay. You may also see what are called fuller forms of names, which, once again, is not necessarily required in RDA unless we have no other way to distinguish between two access points, like in my examples here, like the A.W. Johnson, right? So if both you have two people whose preferred names are A.W. Johnson, but you don't know like when they were born or when they died, etc., but you do know like their first name and middle name, then you can do something like this, but once again called a fuller form of name in parentheses, to differentiate them, right? So that they can have more unique access points that way. And then just additional information if need be. Like I said, professional occupation is an option. That's not something we necessarily did under AACR2, but we do that. We put that information in some field C, like notary or clergyman. And another thing we can do now that we were not able to do under AACR2, the previous set of cataloging rules, is adding words indicating relationship, like junior or the third, etc. So it's not something that's always done now, but it's an option, which I think is really helpful since, it's not like we always know when someone was born and when they died. So having like Hank Williams Jr., for example, that's going to be helpful to differentiate from senior, obviously. So, okay, and then we do need to definitely need to add additional information if you do have once again, a quote unquote person in RDA whose name consists of a phrase or appellation not conveying the idea of a person, whether that's just like, a stage name that someone uses that it doesn't necessarily just make you think of a person. I'll show you an example in just a minute. Or if you have a fictitious or legendary character like, Harry Potter, or if you have something like something that's, so here, like a term indicating type, species, or breed for a real non-human entity. Okay, so that means that if you have like a ship, a boat, right, or if you have like a dog, or a horse, or whatever. So those are all real non-human entities. Okay, so we should add something additional to that to make that clear. So here's some examples from RDA. So here the first, three are human beings, like real human beings. So Stone Mountain, Big Hand, and PSK 13. But these names don't necessarily scream, I am a human being. Like Stone Mountain sounds like the name of a mountain, right? Not a person. And so the addition of like writer in that case is helpful to kind of make that clear. Right? So same thing with like I said, fictitious characters, and like that battleship example, like a battleship could be the name of a battleship. Right? So in this case, it's a racehorse. So you'll see this quite frequently for these types of situations. Okay. All right, so on to authority records. Okay, so we've just talked about how, I've showed you these instructions in RDA for how to construct an authorized access point, determine the preferred form of name. Okay, so there are all these instructions that you can use, right, to do this. But let's talk about how this information is documented. Okay, and these are authority records. Okay, so this is a name authority record that contains information specific to a person, family, or corporate body, but there's also authority records for other things like subject and titles. But this one specifically, we're looking at for like a person, okay? It contains the authorized access point in the 100 field, as well as variant forms like the 400 fields and the 500 fields, as well as just other information, right, about the person that helps kind of distinguish this person from maybe someone with the same name. Okay, so, all right. So, and these authority records can be super helpful to inform even just one bibliographic record. So if you look at just one bibliographic record, the information like in the 100 field and 700 fields, for example, we'll use authority records to inform what we put in those fields. Same thing with like subjects and titles, like I just said. So, because remember, the bibliographic record in MARC should represent a specific resource, okay, as opposed to like a name authority record, which just represents a person, just a person and not any particular work, if that makes sense. So, yeah, so they look very similar on the surface, but they serve different purposes. That's really important to remember. I know that this is something once we get to this point in my cataloging classes, my beginning cataloging classes, my students sometimes start like, getting very confused because they look very similar, but they serve different purposes. Okay, as long as you remember that. And the authority record uses a different type of mark, in fact. What we've been looking at so far in this webinar series has been MARC bibliographic. But now for the MARC authority records, there's actually like this MARC 21 format for authority data. And I'm once again, don't really have the time to go into depth in this, but if you're interested in kind of looking at the different MARC fields in an authority record, this link here, this goes to the Library of Congress's website for this. So I encourage you to take a look at that. But I just wanted to point out just a few important bits in the authority record before I show you kind of how to find these things, okay? So, because they're specific place. So some of the key parts of an authority record for a personal name are, first of all, the 100 field. This contains the personal name authorized access points. And I like to say that I've made this up. This is not a real thing, but it's what's called the Highlander Principle, because there can be only one 100 field in the authority record, which makes sense if you think about it, because we just want to have one authorized access point representing someone, because that's the whole basis of authority control, right? So this follows the Highlander Principle that there can only be one, if you're familiar with that movie and TV series. If not, don't worry about it. Just think there can only be one. Okay, so that's probably the most important part of the authority record. Then we have additional information. These are called Rda Entity Attributes. Okay, they'll primarily, what starts with 3, okay, like 3xx. These are primarily Rda Entity Attributes that provide information about profession, field of activity, language, gender, etc. that can help you identify, right? Because sometimes, like I said, if you have many people with the same name, having this additional information can be helpful for identification purposes. Then, pardon me, we have the 400 fields, which are our variant access points. These are called see from tracings. These are cross-references that should not be used as the authorized access point. These, once again, in theory, if your catalog is using authority control, if you type in, for example, Ellie Wilder, it should direct you to Nora Roberts, the authorized access point. So you can see here that's also different scripts as well. And I think for the most part, the ones in different scripts tend to be like machine generated ones. So yeah, it says down here, yeah, the machine derived non-Latin script reference projects. So they've not been evaluated. So sometimes you'll see that. And then there are sometimes, right, depending on the situation, these see also tracings in the 500 fields, the link to related entities. Okay, so we just discussed before how Eleanor Robertson has other identities, Sarah Hardesty and JD Robb, so they have their own authority records, right? That makes sense. So that's why they're kind of separated out into 500 fields to make it clear that not only are these variant access points, but they're actually alternate identities that have their own authority records, okay? And then the rest, like the 6XX fields, are just kind of general, other information, essentially kind of note fields of the authority record that give you kind of further information about from where the authorized and variant access points have come from, etc. Okay, but one thing the authority record does not do is list everything the person has written or been associated with. That's not the purpose of it. It does include some information about that, about some works, but like I said, the purpose of the authority record is not to just document everything that they've done. Okay, it's just to help you identify mainly the authorized access point and document that information. Okay. And once again, just to make clear that what I just showed you is what's called an authority record that contains information specific to like a person or corporate body or family, etc. But so far, what we've been looking at in this webinar series has been bibliographic record that contain that, WIMI, the work, expression, manifestation, and item information about a specific resource. But what you'll see in the actual OPAC is the bib record, not the authority records. Okay, so if you do try to search for like Nora Roberts' authority record in like the OPAC, okay, maybe in the staff view you can find it, but in the OPAC it's not going to come up, the authority record. Okay, you're just going to find the bib records. So how do we find these authority records? Okay, there's different ways we can do this. So there's Library of Congress Authorities website, which is free and online, and it's Library of Congress's authority file. Okay, it's an authority file that contains authority records. Okay, the file is kind of the overarching thing, and then we have the authority records within. Also, Library of Congress has what's called the linked data service that they use for linked data. It's also free, and it's also Library of Congress's authority file. It just kind of looks a little different because it's not in MARC. If you use OCLC Connection, that also has an authority file, OCLC's authority file, so which is going to have a lot of the same stuff as LC's, but perhaps a bit more, since this is, all the OCLC contributing members will have authority records in that, and you can either input or just search in that. And also, and maybe in addition to these, you'll have your own local authority file. Right? So that may be something, if you're not a cataloger, that may be something you can kind of look into and see if your catalog, your integrated library system rather, has an authority file, right, where you have authority records in there. So, but this is just for the sake of simplicity. I'm just going to show you authority records from the Library of Congress's authority website with lovely 1990s era graphics and functionality, but it works most of the time. So I guess that's at authorities.loc. And you just want to click on the search authorities. Make sure that you choose the name authority headings option. Okay, because you can see here how we can search for like subject headings. We can also search for titles, keyword, etc. But if we're looking specifically for a personal name, we want to type that in and choose the name authority heading search. And here I just have this one, but if you have someone with like a surname and a forename, you want to invert it, like we were talking about before. But here I just searched for this person, Lady Galadriel, which is a real person, obviously a pseudonym. And I found her. We want to choose the one that has what this where it says authorized heading and kind of that red rectangle. I'll make sure we choose the one, or at least try to choose the one that's what's once again quote unquote the authorized heading. That's our authorized access point. And we want to just keep clicking because there's a lot of screens. We just want to keep clicking through until we find in this case, the MARC display of the authority record. You can see here at the top of my screen that you can also click on this labeled display option so you don't see the MARC stuff. That's up to you if you want to do that or not. But here, once again, just kind of similar to what we were just looking at with Nora Roberts, where we want to find, whatever's in that 100 field, and just kind of make sure this is who we want, and then just use that as our authorized access point. Okay, so Okay, so that's the authority record. Okay, so let me go back. So this is where, once again, this is where we document the information about authorized access points. Like I said, we don't have to have an authority record for everyone. In fact, you can make up an authorized access point on your own without an authority record even being involved. But authority records can be helpful, so that way you don't have to just make it up on the fly. You can see, okay, what has already been created, what has already been done, and this will be easier. So to do that, so you can just kind of use what's in that 100 field and use it consistently. Okay, so for proper authority control. But now I want to talk about how we then take that information and put it in our bibliographic record. Okay, so I want to just use this as an example. Brown Bear, What Do You See? Children's book by Bill Martin Jr. and pictures by Eric Carle. So let's just pretend that I have already gone to, LC Authority's website or the OCLC connection website, and I determined that these are the authorized access points for Bill Martin and Eric Carle. Okay, this is in the 100 fields of their respective authority records. Yeah. So what do I do with this information? Okay, so if I, yeah, so Nadine, no, there, shockingly, there is no junior in Bill Martin's authorized access point for some reason. I'm guessing because, remember I was saying before that under the previous set of cataloging rules, you couldn't do that. You couldn't add junior, you just use the dates. So his name was probably, his authorized access point rather, was created during that time period, and then when the RDA came along, maybe they just decided to not change it, right? Just to kind of not add anything, just kind of leave it the way it is. But yeah, so it's so you gotta remember that that's it's not always what you think it will be. There's some inconsistencies there. So good catch, good catch. Let's now take this information and determine what we want to do. Okay, so now that you know how to find an authorized access point for a person within an authority record, right, in that 100 field of the authority record, let's talk about what we do with it in the bib record, okay, the bibliographic record. So here I have from my title page, I transcribe my 245 field containing the title proper. It says, by Bill Martin Jr., pictures by Eric Carle. Okay, let's talk about what we do with this information in the bib record. Okay, so before I do that, I need to make sure you understand that RDA, once again, does not say anything about MARC, obviously. So we can't go to RDA for that, but it does say what we do in terms of whether someone is a creator or a contributor. Okay, so they define a creator as an agent responsible for the creation of a work, so like a Ferber work, right? So like work expression manifestation on him. So this can include like authors or artists, songwriters. And then the contributor is an agent contributing to an expression of a work. So these can be editors, translators, arrangers of music, performers, etc. And even though it doesn't state this here, this can also include contributors to the manifestation and item as well. And there can be multiple creators and contributors to a work and an expression of that work. Okay, it's not like we just choose one for one category and one for another. There can be multiple. And what we want to do also is somehow kind of convert this idea of creator and contributor and fit it within the framework of MARC, okay, which does not have really that same conceptualization, if that makes sense. So what we do have in MARC are two fields for personal name access points that we can use. One is the 100 field, which is what's called the main entry for personal names. Main entry is the same thing as main access point. It's just kind of an older way of saying main access points. And then the 700 field is for added entry personal names. Added entry is the same way of saying added access point. Okay, so this is a distinction in MARC, but not in RDA. RDA has creators and contributors, right? So even though RDA does not have this concept, since it's in MARC and we still just kind of have this concept from cataloging practice way back, we're going to maintain this since we're still using MARC. Okay, once we move beyond MARC, I think we can move beyond this. But while we're still using MARC, we need to understand main and added access points. So like I said, main access point, main entry, same thing. As it says here, it's the entry in a library catalog that provides the fullest description of a bibliographic item by which the work is to be uniformly identified and cited. Okay, so if you think about it, if we think back to like the card catalog days, it's, you know, the card with like the most information with whatever is, you know, the main, like the main author at the top. Okay, so to find that. So, but like I said, in a computer system, it doesn't really distinguish, right? It just, every access point is an access point. So whether it's main or added, but it's this main access point should typically be kind of who is the main author, for example. Okay, if it's a single author, it's that author. But if we have multiple authors, it's, at least for the purposes of this, is the one listed first, is essentially, okay, because there can only be one main access point. The Highlander Principle still applies. So we want to just have one is the main access point. But there can be multiple added access points, okay? So this can be like additional authors, title, illustrators, subjects, etc. So as many as we need, depending on the situation. Okay, so multiple added access points there. Okay, so like I said, we want to use the 100 field for personal name main entries. Like I said, there's only going to be one. The indicators, the second indicator will be blank in the bib record. Okay, but the first indicator, that will change depending on the type of personal name. So if we just have a forename like Madonna, then we want to use 0 in the first indicator spot. Most commonly, you're going to find, you know, the people with surnames, right? So first name, last name, will have a first indicator of 1. And then if it's just like a family name like Dunlop family, then we'll use 3. Okay, so there's only three options here. Same thing with the 700 field. Exactly the same first indicator. The second indicator may be a little bit different depending on the situation. The second indicator of 2 is for an analytical entry. Not going to get into that now, but it'll most likely be blank. Okay, for the 700 field as well. Once again, this is in the bibliographic record, not the authority record. So what we then want to do, now that we have the information from the authority record, we want to take that and put it within our MARC bibliographic framework. Okay, so we don't want to be using authority record MARC in our bib record, even though, in my opinion, somewhat unfortunately, there's the 100 in both, which I think confuses the matter. I wish they used a different field to make that distinct, but I'm not the queen of cataloging yet, so I can't make that change. So what we do, because Bill Martin is the main author, okay, he's our creator. If we think back to RDA, he's our main creator of the work. He goes in the 100 field, he's our main entry. And then Eric Carl is our illustrator, he's our contributor. He goes in a 700 field in the bibliographic record, even though he was listed in the 100 field of his authority record, obviously. So, but since we can only have one 100 field for our main creator, then this is what we do. Okay. And then, in addition, this is something that's technically not required under RDA, but it's very much encouraged, is the use of what are called relationship designators, okay, that are listed in the RDA Appendix I for names associated with a work or expression. And so we put that, for using just the terms, in the subfield E at the end of the authorized access point, just to make clear, right, what is that relationship between the work or expression and the particular person, okay? And this kind of goes back once again to our discussion of Ferber, which is an entity relationship model. So we want as much as possible to really make those relationships clear, even though technically we can just look at the statement of responsibility, but this will be helpful ultimately. If you think about it like in searching, if you're looking for, you know, I like to use like Clint Eastwood is kind of my go-to. Like if you're looking for Clint Eastwood movies where he is, you know, the director and the actor, right? Because sometimes he's just the actor, or maybe he's just the director of a movie. This will then help you, you know, in that search, know kind of exactly what role he's playing in relation to that particular work. Okay, so that's why we have the relationship designator in the bibliographic record and not in the authority record, if that makes sense, because the authority record should just represent the name, just however that you want to have the name in the record, period, but doesn't represent a particular role. Okay. All right, so we're not going to do this now, because we don't have the time. But what I've done is I've put together this little practice exercise in this Google document. In fact, I'll put it in the chat as well if you want to if you're just really super excited and want to do this right away. I don't know when you're going to get the PowerPoint slides, but it's just a very brief exercise where I have this list of 8 names. And I want you just to practice going to either the Library of Congress's authorities website, that's that free one, or whatever you use, like OCLC Connection, whatever you use, okay? And I want you to find the authorized access point for these 8 people, okay? And just that, okay? And just do that obviously on your own. And if you scroll down this Google document, you'll see on the next page the answers. Okay, so but don't cheat. Don't cheat. Just try to do it on your own first so that you can get some practice of finding authorized access points and see how you do. Okay, and once again, if you have any questions, you can just email me and we can talk through any issues that you're having. Okay, so but yeah, this is all I want you to do is just find the authority record for each of these people and determine the authorized access point in that 100 field. Okay. Okay, so keep that in mind. Bookmark that for later. Something fun to do over the weekend. Get bored. Right. I don't know. Maybe that's fun for you. It's fun for me. So I'm certainly not judging in any way, shape, or form. So summary. Okay, so just to remind you all that we need for personal name authorized access points, they need to be unique and they need to be assigned consistently, right? So that author searching is more efficient and effective in your catalog, okay? Even though authority records are not required, they're certainly helpful because they help document the personal name authorized access points. So when in doubt, it's good to double check those authority records to see what is the most up-to-date current form of someone's name, okay, so that you can make sure that that is up-to-date in your catalog. And even if your library does not have a local authority file, you can still work to assign and maintain those authorized access point in your catalog. So it's just, once again, you have a much more efficient and effective search. So, okay, so yay, we still have a couple minutes left. This is rare for me. So questions, because this is my last webinar in this series. It's so sad, but I'm sad. So I like talking with you all, but this is the last one in this series, and yeah, so questions. I know, Amy, I'm devastated, devastated. But let Luli and Taylor and all them know, right? If you want to have more webinars on other topics, let them know, and I'm happy to provide more if you say specifically what you want me to talk about. I'm happy to do it. So yeah, so okay, so Cynthia, you're asking, how do you treat an adapted author to a work? Can you explain further what you mean by an adapted author? I'm not 100% certain what you mean by that. Okay, so it's like an adaptation, like so an author that made an adaptation of a work. Because I mean, I guess so in either way, I mean, we obviously didn't delve too far into how we determine like main and other access points here, but I mean, the same process would involve you in finding the authorized access point, right? If you want to then include the adapter, right, as well as any other names, if you can, in the bibliographic record, including the authorized access point. So depending on how adapted we're talking about. Like one example that I give my students is like this graphic novelization of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Um, and that's, you know, for something like that, the adapter becomes the main access point. He's the main creator because it's modified to the point that it is now a new work. But that does come down sometimes to cataloger's judgment on kind of the extent to which a work has been adapted, to whether it's now just a new expression of that work, if we're thinking about it in Ferber terms, or if it's now like a completely different work. And I think a lot of graphic novels, that's what happens, is they're now like new works. So yeah, the adapter would then become the main entry. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Okay, great question. So anything else you want to talk about, y'all? Okay, thank you, Beth.
All right. If there are no more questions, thank you, Karen, for an informative webinar. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Taylor.